What's up, y'all? So, in Gachiakuta, Amo was raised as a tool. Think about that for a second. Not a person, a tool, a weapon, something to be used. Everything about her upbringing was designed to strip away individuality and replace it with obedience. She wasn't taught how to connect with people. She wasn't taught how to trust people. She wasn't taught how to express herself in a healthy way. And that's what makes every interaction she has with normal people feel so strange. Because from her perspective, normal life is basically alien. When you really think about it, even basic conversations would probably feel weird to someone who grew up like that. Imagine spending your entire life being controlled, manipulated, and used by others. Then suddenly you're surrounded by people joking around, arguing about random things, eating together, teasing each other, and acting like we're family. That would be confusing, seriously. And that's where Enjin becomes such an interesting character in relation to Amo, because Enjin is probably one of the most emotionally open characters in the entire series. He's loud about what he likes, he's loud about what he dislikes, he's comfortable being himself. Whether he's talking about combat, his teammates, or even attractive women, he doesn't really hide what he's thinking. A lot of people remember that conversation as a funny moment, but I think there's something deeper happening underneath it when he's talking to Rudo. Because how would someone like Ammo even process a comment like that? For most people, it's nothing. For Engine, it's just another random thing he says during a conversation. But for Ammo, who knows? That's the crazy part. We don't really know what her understanding of attraction, affection, relationships, or even basic emotional attachment looks like. Her childhood was so distorted that it's entirely possible she doesn't view those concepts the same way most people do. Go back and watch her earlier appearances again. A lot of her reactions aren't reactions that come from somebody who grew up around healthy human interaction. They're reactions from somebody who is still learning what it even means to be human. And honestly, that's why I find her character so fascinating. Not because she's powerful, not because of her abilities, but because every single interaction feels like she's slowly discovering pieces of life that were stolen from her. You could already see it happening, little by little, conversation by conversation, moment by moment. The story isn't just showing us somebody getting stronger, it's showing us somebody learning how to exist outside of trauma, and that's a much harder journey. When people talk about character development, they usually focus on power ups or major turning points, but some of the biggest changes happen during quiet moments, the moments where characters laugh together, the moments where they trust each other, the moments where they realize not everyone is trying to use them. That's where real healing starts. And I think Engine unintentionally plays a role in that, not because he's trying to fix Ammo, not because he's giving her life lessons, but because he's simply being himself. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes somebody who's been trapped in darkness their entire life doesn't need a speech. They just need exposure to normal people. People who laugh, people who care, people who argue, people who make stupid jokes, people who aren't trying to manipulate them. That's something Engine naturally provides. And that's what makes their dynamic so interesting. I don't think people talk about this enough because whenever discussions about ammo happen, the conversation usually focuses on her tragic past. And don't get me wrong, her past is important. It's one of the most disturbing backstories in the series, but eventually the story has to move beyond what happened to her and start showing who she's becoming. That's where the real payoff is. The trauma explains her, it doesn't define her. And that's an important difference. When you really look at Gachiakuta as a whole, that's actually one of the biggest themes running through the story. Rudo is trying to escape the labels placed on him. Amo is trying to escape the damage done to her. Multiple characters are trying to become something different from what the world decided they should be. And honestly, that's why so many people connected with the series. Because beneath all the action and chaos, it's a story about people rebuilding themselves, people learning who they are after being broken, people trying to find meaning in a world that constantly treats them like garbage, literally and emotionally. When you remember who Amo is, where she came from, and everything she's experienced, suddenly that joke creates a whole new layer of curiosity. How does she view relationships? How does she view attraction? How much of normal life is still completely unfamiliar to her? What parts of herself is she still discovering? Those questions are way more interesting than they first appear, and honestly, I think that's one of the reasons Gachiakuta's cast feels so alive. The characters don't feel like they're standing still, even when they're not fighting, even when they're not in the middle of some huge arc. They're constantly changing, constantly growing, constantly learning things about themselves and each other. And sometimes all it takes is one weird little conversation to remind you of that. That's not something people usually bring up. But the more I think about it, the more fascinating that entire interaction becomes. Because underneath the comedy, underneath the joke, underneath Enjin being Enjin, there's a reminder of just how different Amo's life has been from everyone else's. And at the same time, it's a reminder that she's finally surrounded by people who might help her discover what her normal life actually looks like. I'll see you on the next one.